This topic was chosen by my supporters on Patreon.com. If you'd like to learn more about helping support my work, either directly or indirectly, well, you can find details on how to do so in the description down below. Thank you. I'd like you to imagine something. Your name is Frederick Hohenzollern II, though your friends just call you Der Alte Fritz. You're a mighty king and widely regarded as one of Prussia's greatest generals. The year is 1756. You're in the middle of a series of conflicts collectively called the 7 Years' War, although you know it personally as the Third Silesian War, and you have just conquered a new city, Pirna, from its Saxon defenders after a very brief siege. So congratulations! Hip hip huzzay for you! I'm sure it'll be smooth sailing from here on out! But of course, there is one small concern. You see, alongside capturing Pirna, you've also captured its defenders, all 15,000 plus of them. Well, what do you do with these prisoners of war? They were enemy combatants, but now they're surrendered, they're subdued, and they're entirely at your mercy. They might represent a good resource for you in the future, a pretty good bargaining chip. But they're also a pretty big drain on your resources now. Well, you have a few different options. You can, of course, just keep them as prisoners for the duration of the war, but that's rather difficult. Prisoners do have to eat, after all, at least a little bit, and they do have to be housed in some capacity. And this is to say nothing of the guards you'd have to post over them out of your own army. Well, you could always sell them into slavery, make a pretty penny, and get rid of all the prisoners. Except, well, that sort of practice hasn't really been in vogue for, about a millennium or so. So that probably won't work. You probably shouldn't outright murder them either. Looks bad in the papers, you see. Doesn't really work well in the times of the Enlightenment and all that. It's a great way to ensure that your own men held captive by the enemy are going to receive the same exact fate. So that won't work. That won't work either. Well, what if you ransom them? Either exchange prisoners with the enemy, so you both get your people back, or just sell them for a set fee, a certain amount of money for a private, a certain amount of money for a lieutenant. This way you're not giving any undue advantage to the foe, and you're still getting rid of your prisoners. Well, that is, unless you happen to have a lot more prisoners than your enemy does, or if the enemy can't afford to pay off the ransom. You did just capture their city after all, and that tends to be rather expensive. Well, it seems like dealing with prisoners of war is really quite a nuisance. But wait a minute. There is another option, I think, one that we haven't explored yet. What if you do keep the prisoners, and you feed them, and you house them, but what if you also arm them? And now hear me out here. These are soldiers, aren't they? And we're not talking about 19th century fighting for king and country, patriotic, nationalistic citizen soldiers. No. That idea doesn't really start developing until the nationalization of war in the French Revolution. What's the French? Don't worry about it, Fritzy. Don't worry about it. My point is, we are in the middle of the 18th century. Soldiers are scum. They're just numbers on a piece of paper, so use them as the resource that they are. Press these men into your service. Conscript the prisoners of war into your own army. Now, yes, sure, they might grumble a little bit, but just make sure you feed them, you give them good clothing, basically just treat them better than you would otherwise if they were still in the prisons, and I'm sure it'll be fine. They'll be thankful for the service. Except, well, no, it wasn't fine. You see, when Frederick the Great conquered Pirna, he did press the captured Saxon soldiers into his army, and he swelled his forces considerably as a result. However, rather than dispersing these prisoners throughout his forces, using them as replacements and whatnot, he actually pressed entire regiments into his service. Now, this had the benefit, of course, of being administratively very simple, and presumably it would also help the morale of the men as they weren't broken up. They were still among their fellows. Indeed, they even kept their own non-commissioned officers, although many of the commissioned officers would probably have been replaced by Prussian officers. But on the negative side, maintaining these organizations also made defection from the Prussian army very, very easy. You see, despite having his newly pressed soldiers under guard, usually for every 500 Saxon troops there would be an escort of 300 Prussians, and sometimes those Saxon soldiers didn't even get to march with their own firelocks. These Saxon NCOs would oftentimes organize defections, even sometimes mutiny from the Prussian army. Take, for example, quote, at Chemnitz, 100 soldiers of the former Garde zu Fuss used their weapons against Prussian soldiers and escaped. While marching from Wittenberg to Görlitz, some 500 soldiers of the new Fleming Fusiliers killed some of their officers and escaped to Poland. Of course, deserters enjoyed the support of the Saxon population, a conquered population. And even in some instances, when parties of soldiers would be sent out by the Prussians to capture these deserters, they would either just end up joining the deserters or even purposefully fail to capture them. And desertions only became worse when those same Saxon regiments were forced to actually leave Saxony proper, against an earlier promise that they'd only ever be fighting on their own soil. At the Battle of Prague, for example, entire regiments of Saxons would actually defect from their Prussian captors. So Frederick the Great's policy of conscripting prisoners of war into his army did not end very well. But he was hardly the first man to attempt this sort of policy, and he would certainly not be the last. Indeed, while it was not necessarily the best documented thing, the policy of forcing prisoners of war into one's own army does seem to have been common enough that individual nations would specifically include provisions in their treaties aimed at preventing exactly that practice. For example, the Convention of Ecluse, signed between Britain and France in 1759, was an attempt to better codify the treatment and terms of war prisoners by both sides. Among other concerns, it specified that no prisoner was to be forced to enroll in the opposing army. This does imply that either the practice was being conducted before the treaty, either in that war or earlier conflicts, or at the very least that it was a tempting enough concept that nations were willing to explore it, or even just feared that their enemies might consider exploring the concept. However, the impressment and recruitment of war prisoners are two very different concepts, and while it may have been agreed by many nations to not engage in the former, the latter was much more, shall we say, gray in a legal sense. Indeed, during the 7 Years' War and many other wars besides, it was quite common for French recruiters to do their best in coaxing Irishmen into their ranks. There's an excellent example in the case of Corporal Todd of the 12th Regiment of Foot, who was captured by the French in November of 1761. You see, a soldier under the French employment within the Irish Brigade, which was a French military unit which was formed out of Jacobite rebels in the 1690s, attempted to ply Todd with brandy and wine and snuff and all these other luxury items in an attempt to enlist him. However, as one may expect, the lines of voluntary quote-unquote recruitment and forced impressment were often quite blurred, and when Corporal Todd refused to enlist with the French army, the Irish soldier actually cut him over the eye with his sword, and I can imagine that things like this would have likely been relatively common. And threats of violence aside, of course, the initial attempts with alcohol and tobacco do speak to what it was likely the most common method of willingly recruiting prisoners to one's own army, by offering an escape from actual imprisonment. Now, war prisoners often lived in very crude, in basic, overcrowded conditions where disease ran rampant, where abuse, both by other prisoners and likely by one's own jailers and corrupt overlords, was exceedingly common. And while attempts were certainly being made to improve their lot during the 18th century, and there are indeed plenty of examples of this time period in which prisoners are being treated quite well, and indeed they are speaking positively of their captors, well, that is not necessarily the norm. And re-enlisting with your old enemy offers these prisoners an opportunity to escape these squalid conditions. And while a prisoner who was effectively forced by these horrible circumstances to enlist would certainly have a higher risk of defection than the usual soldiery, integrating these smaller bands of men into your wider core of troops was theoretically a very good way to avoid the mass mutinies that we saw among the Saxon troops under Prussian command after Pirna. You can have a few foreign prisoners, just make sure that they are surrounded by loyal soldiers. Now, if we want to look a little bit later on to the American War of Independence, we can actually find a number of excellent examples of this blurring of the line between willful recruitment and forced impressment of prisoners of war. You see, after the failed American invasion of Canada in 1775 and the capture of 405 rebel soldiers, government recruiting agents specifically sought out British-born colonists from their number for recruitment. Of the original 405 prisoners that were taken from Canada, 111 of them actually ended up enlisting again. Later, after the British took control of New York City, the many temporary prisons of that city were often visited by recruiting parties who met with a fairly good amount of success. And these recruiting agents usually performed particularly well during winter, and you can imagine why. The Navy, too, was very likely to draw on these war prisoner populations for sailors, and the passing of the Prohibitory Act in 1775 made rebel ships and crews forfeit to Royal Navy impressment. Indeed, in his article, British Recruitment of Americans in New York During the American Revolution, biased though this article does seem to me with its reference to government forces as the Tory military and to rebels as patriots, well, all the same, author Philip Ranlett argues that, quote, American prisoners of war represented an essential pool of manpower which neither the Tory units nor the British Navy could ignore. British jailers created inhuman conditions to push prisoners into enlisting, end quote. And it is true that their status as rebels and not a foreign standing army did immensely color the British view of American soldiers, and they were not often afforded the luxuries, or indeed the basic needs, which were usually granted to official prisoners of war of foreign nations. And certainly this power dynamic would have weighed heavily on the minds of any man who was approached by a recruiting party, offered a way out of the terrible prison system, particularly again on those prison hulks in New York. That said, of course, the Crown forces were not the only ones in the American War of Independence to draw on prisoners of war as a recruitment pool. The Continental Army, too, made heavy use of British and, more strongly, of German defectors and prisoners both. For example, in 1778, the Continental Congress formed a corps exclusively of German prisoners and defectors, though they were employed usually away from major theaters, either in garrison duties or on the frontier, again speaking to the quality of these soldiers and exactly how you might be able to trust them. They are good as bodies, they are good sort of interspersed among your larger corps of soldiers, but do not rely on them, as the Prussians may have done, in a battle scenario, because they are a lot more likely to defect. It makes them perfect, however, for things like frontier duty, where there really are no opportunities to escape somewhere, and of course, garrison duties, where there's very little reason to want to escape. And then, of course, in 1782, being so short on manpower, the Continentals even went so far as to openly issue a proclamation offering enlistment to German war prisoners and offering promotion to any German NCO or officer who joined up with rebel ranks. Certainly much preferable to a prison sentence. There was also an attempt in 1782 to actually form a corps of Canadian war prisoners, although this proposal did fail to gain enough traction within the Continental Congress and it did fall apart fairly early on. And finally, similar to the British policy, Congress did permit individual states to enlist British and Canadian seamen who were taken as prisoners as well onto their own ships. Now, with all of this being said, on the whole of the 18th century, before the days of the French Revolution, the conscription or enlistment of prisoners of war was not their most common fate. Much more regularly, prisoners would merely be exchanged with opposing forces, even if those exchanges were not even as a part of contracts or deals, and these were arranged either by individual officers and armies on campaign or on a much larger scale between individual states via treaties, which were usually referred to as cartels. However, all the same, there were numerous attempts throughout this history to convert prisoners of war into active soldiers. Now, at times, these attempts have met with success, and other times with great failure, largely dependent, it seems, on the method of that conversion, either through forceful impressment or willing recruitment, and of course, the circumstances in which these methods were applied, exactly how willing that recruitment truly was. But the lure, you see, of such great advantages, of not only reducing the strain on your own resources by having less prisoners to deal with, but also by expanding your own military figures and reducing the potential manpower of your enemy, would ensure that armies would continue attempting these sorts of recruitment models. Indeed, the practice would only ever really be lessened after the French Revolutionary and subsequent Napoleonic Wars near completely demolished the old Ancien Regime methods of dealing with prisoners of war. But all of that, I think, is a very different subject. And if you are interested in learning more about all of that, well, I'll include a link down below in the description for an article you can read all about that sort of thing, alongside all of the other sources I've used in producing this video. Now, thank you also very much for watching, of course, in particular to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com, by whose support this video was not only possible, but by which today's video subject was chosen in the first place. And of course, to you as well, my dear viewer, for I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.